Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am Jason Moorfield, a Vita Master from Central Virginia, and last weekend I played in the Virginia State Championships for, well, it's I've played in that tournament a lot, but this time was different because last year I had actually upset a Grandmaster-elect to become state champion, and this year I was the top seed and returning champion, attempting to defend my title. In order to win this tournament, I would have to finish ahead of not only two former state champions, but also a field of hungry prodigies rated about 2100 to 2200 in some cases, trying to take the title for the first time. So this was a unique experience for me because I had not been the favorite in a tournament since 2016-2015. I much prefer being the third or fourth most favored because that allows me to strike from the sidelines and not have as much attention on trying to beat me every game. But when I'm the returning champion, everybody is going to be trying to beat me. And it felt very strange going to a tournament with that big a target on my back. So, from the title of this video, you can already tell that I did it. So let's dive into how. Round 1, I was matched up against Arjun Srinivasan, who is a very talented young player. He started playing in 2017 and was already high 1800s USCF. For reference, I became a national master in 2017, and I was just starting out. So my opponent started off very strong with, sorry, I should probably just flip through the moves at least. The classical Sicilian, my opponent played a rouser, which is the most theoretically challenging response, and went for the type of structure with castling queenside, f4, and bishop takes c6, bishop takes f6, which black is hoping that if I take back with the bishop, my opponent's going to retreat the knight and play g4. And with like g5, h4 coming, I'm very passive. So I took back with the g-pawn, but then my kingside pawn structure is a little bit messed up, and I'm probably not going to castle over there. I could, technically, but it's a little bit more risky now that the pawn's on f6 and not g7, where it would be defending my king. And after this point, however, my opponent demonstrated that they didn't really know how to play this type of structure. They wanted to play f5, which, yeah, that's the right thing to do. I play queen to b6 to avoid to prepare castling queenside, and my opponent knight to b3. What's the knight doing on b3? In the classical Sicilian, white's goal is to attack the king side, put pressure on black's center in the light squares, in order to prevent black from just overrunning on the queen side where they have superior dark square control. Knight to b3 does nothing to help that. Knight to f3 would have been a much better way to avoid me exchanging pieces. And for reference, white wants to avoid exchanges of pieces in these types of positions because black, having the more compact or well-defended pawn structure and better square control over the dark squares, would have the superior endgame. So knight to b3, I castle. I'm just moving my pieces into decent squares. h5 prevents bishop to h5, which would have been annoying. Knight to e5 puts a knight on an outpost. h4 safeguards the pawn. And my opponent makes another strange move, h3, which is completely unnecessary. They were concerned about me playing like h3 myself, but that wasn't even on my radar because white can just go f3. Well, g3, I can't really take on f3 unless I want to get rid of my fantastic knight for that terrible bishop. So yeah, that was just a waste of a move. And after a couple more moves, I was able to completely take over with the breakthrough d5. My opponent can take the pawn, sure, but then I take on c3, and my opponent can't take the rook because I will checkmate with bishop to a3. So that would not be a great idea. Instead, they moved back to b3. But now they just moved knight d2 and back to b3, and I actually started an attack. So I felt like it was time to strike. I played the move rook takes c3, b takes c3, queen e3 check. And now, since king b2, knight c4 check would just practically be checkmate already, with queen c3 and queen b2 coming, there's really nothing white can do to stop it if knight c4 comes with check, because they lose a lot of time for defending. My opponent had to play king to b1, and I grabbed the pawn on e4. Now, my opponent did not like the look of a variation like queen to e2, takes, 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 where I have 2 pawns for the exchange, meaning that it's fully adequate material compensation, and my opponent has a bunch of pawn weaknesses as well. Sure, I have tripled pawns, but this one's relatively well defended. I don't really have to worry about losing those tripled pawns. However, these pawns on c3 and g2 are not well defended, so I was very confident in my position. Instead, white played d takes e6, hoping to go for the exact same thing but without losing the f5 pawn. This falls victim to an intermediate move, bishop to b5, which my opponent completely missed. And though they have some chances to get back into the game, there was only one more critical moment. So here I have 2 minor pieces for a rook, so that's just a 1-point material advantage. Why are you acting like the game is over? It's not over. You're absolutely correct about that. However, I do have a massive advantage in this case, because every one of white's remaining pawns is weak, and my knight and bishops are well positioned to attack them. So it's not so much that it's the 1 pawn advantage that's winning. It's that what white has left is very difficult to defend. Which means white decided, I'm not going to defend it at all. I'm going to go for a counterattack, which was the right thing to do, because I stumbled a little bit. With knight to f3, my opponent played the move I completely missed, pawn to c4. And I'll give you a minute or two to try and figure out how to defend against that. Full disclosure, you could have just paused the video. I should have just asked you to do that, but I'm new to this whole recap thing. So the correct answer is after bishop takes c4, white has the incredibly powerful move for rook to d7, after which white is going to win the pawn on b7 with check, and my conversion task is going to become a lot harder. So instead I had to play bishop c6, and after knight a5, bishop e4, rook d7, you might be thinking, you'd literally just let the same thing happen, you bozo. If you say the word bozo, that's a relatively unpopular word. But, probably something similar if you don't. And the answer is, it's not similar, actually. It might be kind of similar. But the key point is that white has to take with the knight. After bishop to f8, you'll see why this is useful in a second. I'm trying to push the rook to f7. Bishop to a3. If white takes with the rook on b7, they just lose an exchange. And they won't have enough pieces left to do anything serious to my king. So they take on b7, and I play rook to g8. This is why I force the rook to f7. And after white has no choice but to exchange rooks with rook to d8. And now, instead of defending my pawns and winning the endgame the long and boring way, I play knight to e1. And white plays a very nice defensive resource c5, hoping for bishop takes c2, knight d3, and rook to b7. Sure, I'm still winning after king c8, but why even allow that when I can just play king c8 now? Takes, check, and knight d3. My opponent was very inventive and tried to come up with some stalemate resources. For instance, after f5, takes c6, I can't play bishop to b2 check, because if rook takes b2, knight takes b2, c7, crazy enough, white wins. But I did not allow that. I just played king to d5, rook d8, king c4, because taking on c5 would have allowed a skewer. I'm threatening checkmate now. My opponent gave up their rook, and it's not stalemate because white still has a pawn left. So white advanced, and then resigned, because bishop to b2 checkmate is coming, and white can't do anything to stop it. With this win, I stay in first place, and one of the 2 state champions trailing me suffered a draw in round 1, which was huge news for me because that, A, hurt his tie breaks. The earlier you don't win a game in this tournament, the worse your tie breaks are. And B, because it would mean it was be a lot harder for that person to win the tournament. For reference, Daniel Miller, that player, has won the world, not the world champion, the state championship 6 times already. He was looking to make it a 7th. So round 2, I am up against Samuel Key, and the 2 next highest rated players in the tournament, one of whom was a state champion and one of whom was, I believe, a senior in high school. I'm not entirely certain. Anyway, they were both just trailing me by 0 points, just by rating, and so I had to keep winning if I wanted to stay on top. Up against Samuel Key, my opponent employs Vaquero-Con, which was not an opening that I saw them play at any point. I had prepared for the game a little bit beforehand, and they didn't really play this opening, so I wasn't really expecting it. But the good thing about that is that it meant they were just as out of book as I was, when after I played knight to f3, they played the rather strange bishop to g4. It feels like this is the type of move that black wants to play in this sort of opening, but it does have a bit of a drawback. That drawback is that after knight c6, c3, the bishop is constantly vulnerable to queen to a4 ideas. Not necessarily here, but like after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, black just loses because of the threat bishop b5 winning the queen back. And this, like for example, this would be absolutely brutal. So they instead play e6, I play bishop to e3. And now if they play knight e5, I have queen a4 check anyway, unpinning with tempo. If the knight moves, I win the bishop, so black can try to be clever, but it doesn't work. So I fully expected black to play something like knight e7, f5, when I had knight bd2 and bishop d4 prepared to hold on to the pawn. But they instead decided to take on f3, and then e5. I mean, sure, this wins the pawn back, but I felt it rather strange, because I get bishop b5 check, the knight has to move again, else the king would be stuck in the center forever, and I castle. And I've got a fantastic position here. My opponent has their king in the center and no development, but they do have a very solid position. So the next few moves, my top priority was finishing development and opening the center. I'm even willing to sacrifice my b2 pawn to achieve this, though my opponent can take rook b1, and I've got a ton of open lines. In general, open lines favor bishops and closed positions favor knights. I want to open up the position, also because it helps me with my development advantage. Instead, my opponent plays knight e7, but instantly makes a huge mistake. Instead of taking on d5 with the pawn to continue holding my knight back, I would have said still had like a really good position after that, but it wouldn't have been as good. My opponent took on d5 with the queen, and after knight to e4, black was in serious trouble. My opponent definitely looked like they were not having fun in this position. Maybe their best option is to play something like knight f5, at least in practical terms. Although here, black has a really awful pawn structure and the king's still in the center, so I would give a huge advantage to white. Not as big as in the game, though, where they just castled kingside. And after knight takes f6, g takes f6, queen takes f6, instead of just agreeing, yeah, I'll be down a pawn for a while, I'm just going to like dig my heels in and do a tough defense, though. They played queen h5, allowing me to trade the knights to force the knight away from the defense of the king. Whoops, yeah. And bishop h6. Threatening checkmate on g7 and the rook on f8. My opponent tried to defend and keep the queens on, but after the nice intermediate move f3, forcing the exchange of queens, there really was nothing my opponent could do. And so I'll just play through the rest of the game relatively quickly, but, you know, not much happened. My opponent just realized at this point they had no chance of saving the game and just started to give up pieces and allowed checkmate in one move. So yeah. Interesting, this is the end of day 1 of the tournament, and when I woke up the next day, I found that both of my closest rivals, the 2 players rated just beneath me, had managed to draw only in their second round game, which was huge. which meant that if I could stay at least on pace with them, I would have better tie breaks for most of the tournament. So the Daniel Miller in fourth place also won his game, so he was on 1.5, but had worse tie breaks out of all of them. So going into rounds 3, I was black against Arnav Gupta. I had played Arnav Gupta in the 2019 Virginia Closed. I needed a win with black, and my opponent gained a big advantage out of the opening, and then decided to do nothing and offer a draw. I found that rather strange. I mean, like, you're sure I'm higher rated, but you got a better position, why not try and use it? And my opponent isn't ambitious enough to do that, I guess. Anyway, I knew my opponent wasn't going to be playing ambitiously with white. So they usually play the Catalan, which is what in fact they played in the game. So I had to come up with an interesting way to play against the Catalan. And so I went with kind of a hybrid of two systems I've been studying, with d takes c4, knight f3, a6. And after a4, instead of going for the knight c6, rook b8 stuff, I played c5. The idea is that inserting a4 and a6 has weakened the b3 square. So as opposed to the Catalan variation where black just plays c5 here, black is hoping for an improved version of that. Castles, knight c6, d takes c5, takes, and now the move that's trying to exploit that difference, knight to d7. I'm hoping to get some activity on the queen side, and sure, black is not objectively better in this position, nor are they like practically better necessarily. The sole goal of doing this was to get white out of Catalan theory and get myself into an interesting position that I might be able to win. And that worked. My opponent defended the pawn. I traded bishops. Please note, rook takes d7 is not a remove the defender tactic, because black can take on e3. The rook would be forced to move away, and then the bishop moves away. So bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, knight d2, c3. Takes bishop d7. And this was the idea. White's got a solid position with a Catalan bishop as usual. However, they also have two isolated pawns on the queen side, and I've got a very solid position as well. So I was just hoping to play this on for as long as was necessary until I either converted or my opponent defended for 4 hours and agreed to a draw. I did not expect to be in a dangerous position here because my position's very solid. But over the next few moves, my opponent starts playing very accurately. Knight to c4, threatening knight d6. a5, getting the pawn off of the weak square a4. Sure, this is kind of weak eventually too, but my bishop can't help attack it. So I maneuver my rook to c7 so that I can better attack this pawn, and my opponent exchanges off my powerful c5 knight. I play rook to d8 just to try and exchange more pieces, because my only weakness on the queen side is on b7. It's easier to defend if all the rooks are off, and white's pawns start to become weak when that happens. So that's why I was trying to trade rooks. You might be asking, hey, wait a minute, can't white take on h7? Yeah, white can, if they want their bishop to get trapped. So this is a relatively famous trap. I didn't expect my opponent to fall for it, which they didn't. They instead played rook to b1. And here, I tried to get a little bit too fancy. I'm looking for ways to get out of my binds and start putting pressure on white to grab the initiative. And I'm thinking like, if I go knight b8, then white has knight b6, maybe knight a8 to win this pawn. Maybe if I play f5, white will take here, then play knight e5, which is annoying. Oh, I know. What if I attack the knight and prepare a maneuver to b5 at the same time with knight to a7? At first, this looks great. If white moves the knight away, I can just go knight b5, and my knight blocks everything on the queen side. Like knight e3, knight b5. Not only am I threatening knight c3, but after a move like knight d1, I can play knight d6. b7 is super well defended, c3 is under attack, and I've taken over the game. What I completely missed was after rook takes b7, I can't take this knight. I thought, takes, and I'm up a piece. But white has the intermediate move bishop d3, which I did not see in advance. That's an inexcusable tactical blunder by me, I know. But Yeah, I was like, wait, I'm just lost. After rook takes c3, rook takes a7, my opponent's going to win this pawn by force. And I think it would be extremely difficult, if at all possible, to stop the a-pawn from becoming a queen after that, considering the activity of white's pieces and the lack of any weaknesses at all in his position. So I realized, shoot, I gotta defend this endgame now. If I lose this game, my chances of becoming a state champion dramatically decrease. All my main rivals lost earlier, and this would just equalize the tiebreaks. But if they could stay ahead of me, then I'd be in some serious trouble. So I realized I had to dig my heels in and defend as hard as I could. And so I started thinking here, like, do I want to take on b7 and play bishop c8? Do I want to defend like this? I eventually decided to play knight b5 and just settle down for a long defense. After rook takes c7, my opponent instantly offers a draw. I can't decline that. I'm down a pawn in a position that I'd be extremely unlikely to win because I have nothing to attack. And I asked my opponent why he did that after the game, and he was like, I don't know, didn't feel like I'd win that. You're not even going to have me try to defend, you're just going to assume I'm going to do it successfully. Okay, fair enough. We played some games after that to see what the actual evaluation would be, and he won 3 of them in a row. So I definitely dodged a bullet with that draw offer. Honestly, it kind of felt like plot armor, which was kind of disappointing. I wanted my opponent to make me at least earn the draw, but I can't make my opponents play better. So my opponent learned from his mistake and ended up scoring a really neat win against one of my main competitors later in the tournament. We can talk about that shortly. So next round, I'm on 2.5. There are 10 players on 2.5 out of 3. 10. And there's only like 40 in the tournament at all. So I have to make sure I win the next few games and stay on the best tiebreaks. And I'm white against Isaac Steinkamp. Isaac was actually my coach. Not necessarily a coach. He was the head coach of a chess camp I attended when I had just started playing. I never paid him directly for lessons, so he's not really my coach. I never really had one of those. But since I was in the camp, and he was the professor, yeah, it definitely felt like I was going up against somebody who used to train me at least a little bit. So, not quite the mentor thing because it lasted like a week, but still felt it interesting to have us play in a tournament with the rating gap practically the opposite. My opponent was like rated 2000 something USCF, which definitely meant I was a favorite. Also, I'm afraid I have to alter my rating here while I'm on here. Name and ratings. I am 2367 USCF. That was a mistake. So after e4, c5, knight f3, g6, I go for the move c3. I saw that Isaac plays against the Maroczy bind with c4, knight c3, and d4 a lot, but rarely plays against the c3 stuff. So I felt pretty confident going into this because A, I didn't see that they had much experience, so we were at least on even terms with us both not having much experience in these positions. And B, my opponent's got less space. The knight on g8 is really awkward, and yeah, I've just got a comfortable position. So they play he plays bishop to g4, I play knight bd2. The idea being, I want to be able to take back with the knight and defend both of these pawns. Knight c6, bishop to d3. I gotta admit, I was kinda hoping for knight takes d4, queen to a4 check, which wins one of the pieces on the 4th rank, depending on how black blocks. Black can block with one of the pieces, but not both of them. Of course, my opponent didn't fall for that, and after h3, I was just expecting bishop takes f3, knight takes, knight e7, and we'd have a relatively normal game. I'd have a slight advantage because of my bishop pair and pawn center, but it wouldn't be anything serious. But instead, my opponent played bishop to f5. So I thought it was a really strange move, and indeed it actually did turn out to be strange. Because after bishop takes f5, g takes f5, knight b3, My opponent just has weak pawns on the king side. I've got bishop to g5 as an idea. I've got knight g5 as an idea. Maybe even knight c5. Maybe even g4. I've got a ton of ways to try and take advantage of black's weakened position. And they played the very strange move, bishop to f8. And so I'm like, okay, what was that? Why are you playing bishop to f8? You're not even going to try and play knight g7 castle. You're just going to move the bishop back to the starting position. So I wanted to punish it. But after reviewing after the game, the computer's like, why are you doing that? Are you subject to human emotions? Absolute fool, you buffoon. And wants me to just castle or something instead, saying that losing time is with bishop f8 is enough punishment for black. I don't have to add anything on. Because like bishop e7, while it looks like a natural move, completely immobilizes the knight on g8, so black's going to have some trouble developing their pieces. But after knight g5, bishop b4, I can't block on d2, because then what black takes on g5, and I'm in some trouble. So I have to play king to f1 instead. h5 was a very strange move. I was kind of expecting my opponent to play something like knight g7 and knight g6. Even though I can take here, it's definitely kind of questionable whether that actually results in anything. Because after knight f8, knight f6, queen takes f6, black wins a piece. But instead, my opponent wanted to stop the invasion entirely, which I think was actually the greater of two evils. Because after h4, I solidify my incredibly powerful knight on g5. Now that it can never be attacked with h6, it's extremely safe and extremely strong. It was only strong before, but it was very vulnerable to attack. So rook c8, rook h3. I might have played rook king to f1, but that doesn't mean my rook can't become active. Knight a5, a3. Now that I've got complete control over the king side and I'm preventing black from castling ever because of the queen takes h5 idea, I decided the right thing to do is to invade on the queen side. And so that's what I focus on doing the next few moves. My king ends up going to g1 anyway, which is pretty fun. And black tries to safeguard the queen side so that I can't invade. To which I respond, okay, you can try. The knight can get to c6, but I trade off your best defender of the dark squares. I move my rook to the open file. Pin your knight. Just note, none of these pawns can be taken. The knight can't move because of this pin, and if queen takes here, I have rook b3 and rook b7 with a completely crushing position. Black's pawn on f7 is going to fall, and then the game's just going to be over in a couple of moves. So after king to e7, rook c5, my opponent still can't take here for the same reason. They retreat, I play b4. And from here, it's a matter of time. I just attack on the queen side until I break through, which is a small breakthrough, sure, but I now have a target on the queen side. And once black has fully just curled up to defend that, I move to attack the king side. I'm threatening queen g5 now, and also maybe knight here. And if knight f4 doesn't lead anywhere itself, I can always play knight d3 c5 to add more forces over to the queen side. Black's just lost here. There's no way to defend in the long run. Rook g8, knight f4, queen a8. Knight takes h5, rook g4. Trying for a counterattack, but I have the really strong move knight to f6. It would be possible to defend here. Like black's attacking two pawns, sure I can defend one of them. But whenever at all possible, if you can continue to attack because you've judged your opponent's counterattack not to be dangerous, do that. After knight f6, my opponent can't take on h4 because of the fork. They take my knight, and then I have this fork, and all of black's position is just crumbling. It's probably mate soon. I'm not going to check because I would be able to win the game anyway. And after rook to d4, queen g5, I don't see a way black can stop this discovered check from winning everything without losing the queen. So they realize I have to retreat the rook, and after h5, I'm just going to promote my h-pawn. I'm not going to attack the king, I'm just going to promote the pawn. And if my opponent manages to stop the pawn somehow, they have to bring pieces away from the defense of their king, and that's how I'm going to get to it. So this game was an excellent example of how distracting your opponent's pieces by attacking on both sides of the board can be an excellent way to convert an already winning position. Full disclosure, if it's even, it usually doesn't work. So next up we got round 5. I am black against Kevin Su. Thing about going into this round, in round 4, both Daniel Miller and Andy Samuelson were upset. Andy by Arnav Gupta from the previous rounds, who had taken to heart the don't offer draws in better positions against higher rated players, and just crushed it. So Daniel Miller also lost to a young talent who I was playing this round. Because Kevin had just beaten the former state champion, I thought, yeah, this is going to be a really tricky game. And my main goal going into this game was, sure, I would win if I could. But if I couldn't win, I'd accept a draw and play for a win in the last round with the white pieces. So I go for the same opening I did in the first round, because it's, in my view, a very good way of trying to win with black. My opponent goes for the same stuff. This is actually the exact same position, but here my opponent plays knight f3, which I consider to be a better move order, because after b5, not only does black have to take back with the bishop to avoid losing to like queen d6. Sure, maybe it's not losing, but it's not great. But the b5 pawn has already been advanced, meaning black's king is not going to be as safe on the queen side when it castles there. So king b1, queen b6, f5. Castles queenside, knight e2. My opponent is correctly showing how to attack this position. White is playing for an attack on e6, going all in on that front, and not just, defending like the first round opponent did. So king b8, knight f4, bishop c8, queen to e1. And my opponent's actually done a fantastic job of applying pressure here. If I was to play a move like d5 in this position, then after takes e5, my entire position is under fire. I don't like my position at all. Knight e2 allows like maybe a knight reroute. Sure, I have bishop takes f5 in this particular position, but I have to be extremely careful. So my opponent decided instead, I decided instead of doing that, perhaps it would have been better than what I did in the game actually, to play h5. And my opponent finds an idea that I did not see. And this is just a testament to the fact that I was relatively inexperienced with these structures. I definitely should have seen this. F takes e6, f takes e6, g3. And here I realize, oh wait a minute, white's about to play bishop to h3, and this pawn's going to fall. So here's the thing about my e6 pawn. I got really good control over the dark squares, but my light square control sucks. So I need that pawn on e6. If I advance it to e5, white goes knight d5, and I'm instantly much worse. If I lose the pawn, it's even worse than that. So I start thinking I'm starting to have a difficult time figuring out what to do until I decide I'm going to sacrifice my pawn structure to defend that pawn and get some activity. So here, what I was expecting, what the computer agrees white should have played, was takes, bishop g2. And white has a fantastic position with a lot of play against my weaknesses, but in exchange, I have dynamic counterplay with bishop g4, maybe bishop c5, rook e8. Computer finds a way to defend easily with white, but my opponent was not so sure. So they played bishop h3 instead, which was a major inaccuracy. Because after d takes e4, white has to take on e6. And then black has the bishop pair and a passed e-pawn, and so is slightly a better position. Although it is definitely complicated. So after d takes e4, queen takes e4, however, I was not expecting this move, to be completely blunt. Because after bishop to b7, white just loses the rook. This felt extremely anticlimactic, to be completely honest, so I apologize for your viewing experience if it feels that way to you. But my opponent, if I win this game, I am massively favored going into the final round because I'll be a half a point ahead of everybody with better tie breaks than everybody else, and I'll just need a draw to clinch the title. And this just got me there. Completely out of the blue. 1 minute I'm worse in fighting to stay in the game, and my opponent misses a tactic. I guess this is just a factor for like the fatigue of these tournaments. This was the final day of a 3-day tournament. My opponent had already played for many hours and had defeated a former state champion. I guess I'll never know why the mistake happened. Maybe my opponent won't either. But I definitely felt grateful that after bishop g7, bishop b7, queen d3, bishop takes h1. Well, I can't even take the bishop because of queen takes d4. After knight takes e6, bishop b7, I just gave back in exchange to leave myself a full piece up because I felt that would make it easier, and indeed it did. I pin the knight, attack the king, get my king out of the way so that I don't run into anything weird. My opponent offers an exchange, and of course I take it. Takes, check, my opponent resigns. Not only am I piece up, but I'm starting an attack on the king that will likely result in mate in a couple of moves. For instance, king to e2 allows queen d3, king e1, knight f3, and mate is coming up right. Next move. So, crazy. Well, yeah, I guess white can defend technically for another move, but semantics. Yeah. After this game, I was a half point up going into the final rounds, and a win would guarantee me at least guarantee me clear first, and a draw would guarantee me possibly clear first. But if a rival on board 2-1, they would get shared first place, so we shared the cash prize, but I win the title on tiebreaks. And the title was what I was there for. I go in as state champion, I want to leave as state champion. So in round 6, I'm up against my closest rival, Sudarshan Sriniar, the second highest rated player in the tournament, who I had just beaten a couple of weeks prior. And this is a very interesting game. In the last Virginia State Championships, final round, I was up against him as well. I played d4, he played a quiet system, he offered a draw after a little while, I accepted. But in this tournament, I figured he was going to be trying to win. And I was looking for a fight, so I decided to go into a Sicilian. Now, full disclosure, I wasn't going in blind. I knew my opponent played the Sicilian because I played it against the actual classical Sicilian because I played it against he played it against me in that said game. I figured he had an improvement somewhere. So I wanted to deviate from the game by, instead of playing f3 like I did there, and the game continued like takes, bishop e7, king b1, queen here, queen d2, b5, h4, something like this. I played king to b1, which can transpose in a lot of variations. In fact, I was kind of hoping for that. But it also allows a bunch of interesting sidelines that my opponent could have also played. And after the game, my opponent told me this worked extremely well, because against f3, my opponent was planning to play something other than knight takes d4. So I deviated first and put my opponent in the position of being the first one to need to think. So they took on d4 like in the earlier game and played bishop to e7. I'm like, all right, h4. And I just play normally. First of all, the reason I'm retreating the queen is because I want to play bishop to d3 without running into e5, just attacking the queen and forcing it back to a really awkward square. Also because it's just not a good piece on d4. It gets in the way of white's pieces. So queen d2, b5, f3, b4, knight e2, a5, c4. And you may have noticed, we transposed into the game. So I fully expected my opponent to take a look at this variation, to have already seen it, like in between tournaments, and work out the best way to continue. But here's the thing. So did I. I'm going for a draw here. And black has two options in this position. Black can castle kingside and go for a really double-edged position, but one where they're worse, because I have a space advantage and a head start in the attack. Or they can trade into an endgame. But the endgame is very difficult for white to lose. So given that the two options were a sharp but better position and a quiet but hard to lose position, I figured I'd go for that if I only needed a draw. So after a4, h6, bishop e3, Sudarshan improved on our previous game where he castled and allowed me to just attack with g4. I won the game in some very nice fashion. That may be a subject of another video eventually, I don't know. They played rook to b8, which is the recommendation of Shanklin in one of his courses. In g4, queen b3, bishop to b5. Bishop takes b5, and my opponent here offers a draw. So if my opponent was to continue, the game would have looked something like a takes b5, and now in order to avoid g5 with tempo, retreating the knight, trying to get it here, I stop that. Opponent castles, I play queen c2. And this is an endgame that's very difficult for white to lose, because white has the advantage on the queen side and a passed pawn. My opponent has 5 versus 4 on the king side, but none of the pawns are really able to do much of anything. So, considering that Sudarshan saw that endgame coming and knew that I had likely studied it beforehand, because I was still playing instantly and he wasn't, offered a draw. Since the draw clinched the title, I took it. My closest rival did not manage to win their game, and as such, I won the tournament in clear first place with a score of 5 out of 6 points, and became the Virginia State Chess Champion for the second year in a row. Funnily enough, I got the rating report after this, and I gained a total of 1 rating point from this, which I definitely appreciate how objective the rating system. Why did my headphones just turn off mid-recording? That's rude. Anyway, the rating system doesn't care whether you have a good tournament or a bad tournament. It just is. It's like, you know what, Jason? That was average. Actually, I expected better. You get 1 rating point. So, yeah. Anyway, I hope to be back making videos more often soon. This is a relatively long one, so apologies. I'll try and break it up into sections when I upload this. So yeah, thank you all for watching. Make sure to do all of the like, comment, subscribing things that the YouTubers always tell you to do. And except for the Patreon, I don't have that yet. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you on my Twitch or in my comment section sometime soon.